So we're at collegeboard.org. I'm going to scroll down, click on SAT. We'll go down from here, click on Practice. Scroll down to SAT Practice Tests. We'll go down to Practice Test 10, See All, and click the top button. So we are looking at, starting on page 4 here, a 65-minute test, 5 passages and 52 questions, so this is a long one. Try them. Whether you do it one at a time, the video goes in order, or if you want to go ahead and do all 5 at once.
The first reading passage is always the literature passage, which can be approached a little bit different than some of the other types. Diction and imagery play a bigger role here in the literature passages, and oftentimes students do the best on this section. Here we have a relatively recent production, 2010, and this is about a particular family in a city in Georgia in the 1930s and their experience with their... So let's just jump to the questions then. Number 1, the narrator of the passage can best be described as, and there's a variety of options. Some clues come from the story. Coming off the train, she assured us. Later, what we really wanted to know, and then probably the best clue is here, all 26 of us across 7 grade levels in the one room. Given those pronouns of the us and the we, we're probably talking about some of the students. A is the best choice. Number 2, in the passage, 3-step is mainly presented as a, and there's this section where they say, she wanted to bring democracy and education to the poorest, darkest, most remote, and forgotten corner of America. They sent her to 3-step Georgia. So they're implying that this is a poor area, it's dark, it's remote, it's forgotten. Does that sound like a town that's home to a prominent university or a comfortable suburb? No. And certainly people aren't vacationing there. Small rural town is the best choice. 3, it can reasonably be inferred from the passage that some of the people at the train station regard Miss Spivey's comment about the Georgia heat with... And it's worth noticing here that this is a paired question, so you're going to find the answer to number 3 in one of these 4 locations. So it might be worth checking those 4 out just to find the answer. Turns out it's going to be in the second one here, lines 10 through 14. And the answer is going to be resentment, because they feel she is minimizing their discomfort. And that shows up here. August was a hellish month to step off the train in Georgia, although it was nothing, she said, compared to the 119 degrees that greeted her when she arrived one time in Timbuktu, which she assured us was a real place in Africa. I believe her remark irritated some of the people gathered to welcome her on the burned grass alongside the tracks. There's our best evidence right there, and when folks are sweating through their shorts, they don't like to hear that this is nothing compared to something else. Lines 10 through 14. Number 5, Miss Spivey is most likely using the phrase fruitful intermission in line 26 to indicate that. So backing up a bit, she'd gone to boarding school since she was 6 years old. She'd studied French in Paris and drama in London. And during what she called a fruitful intermission in her formal education, she had traveled extensively in a variety of places with her friend. So let's think about what this word fruitful means. If you plant a seed and let something grow and it bears fruit, for all your time and effort, you get something out of it. And the intermission part is this is a break from her schooling. She took a break, but she got something out of it. And nowhere did she decide to start a medical school. And it wasn't her early years that resulted in the unanticipated rewards. And though the break might have lasted longer, that's not what we're really talking about when we say fruitful intermission. A is the best choice. Number 6, the interaction between Miss Spivey and Ralford serves mainly to... So when my little brother Ralford asked what did she study at Barnard College, Miss Spivey explained that Barnard, which she wrote on the blackboard, was the sister school of Columbia University, of which she expected we all had heard. Do you think a bunch of kids in this rural town had ever heard of Columbia University? How many of you have heard of Columbia University? It might be famous in some circles, but would they have any reason to know this? Probably not. She's not especially friendly here either. And we're not saying that Ralford is a genius, and she's not really being dismissive or disinterested. She is answering the question. And they're not looking to amuse her. They're genuinely curious. She has an exaggerated view of what should be common knowledge, especially for this. Number 7, in the third paragraph, what is the narrator most likely suggesting by describing Miss Spivey as having wandered in one situation and marched in another situation? So she started off by wandering into a lecture by the famous John Dewey. If you wander around, the connotation there is that you don't have a purpose, you're just traveling for whatever reason, flexible, easygoing, no direct mission. And later she marched to the teacher's college. Now if you're marching, you have discipline, you have purpose, you know where you're going. The only answer choice that contrasts those two, and keeps in mind their diction, is choice D. Wandering was not on purpose, and then decisive action is the marching. Number 8, according to the passage, Miss Spivey ended up in three-step as a direct result of... So rarely does this happen, but the answer pretty much is given to you in the passage, right here. 2 years later, she told a cheery blue-suited woman from the WPA that she wanted to bring democracy and education to the poorest, darkest, most remote, forgotten corner of America. They, the WPA, sent her to three-step Georgia. So the answer choice is the only one that mentions the WPA. Number 9, in the passage, when Miss Spivey announces that she had seen camels, the student's reaction suggests that they are... And can you guess what we saw from the train? Miss Spivey asked. We could not. Camels, she said. We saw a whole caravan of camels. She looked around the room, waiting for us to be amazed and delighted. She thought they would be amazed and delighted. But they all hung there for a minute, thinking hard. Why would the students be thinking hard? Well, they didn't really know what camels are. So it takes one of the students speaking up and explaining what camels are before they really can even picture it. So they're not delighted or fascinated, and they're definitely not worried, but they're more so baffled as to what is she talking about. That line I just showed you is 85 through 86. This was the other paired passage, or paired question rather. Every passage has 2 of these paired questions. If you pay close attention and mark them ahead of time, saves you time looking for answers. The second passage is a social science passage, and this one is called The Conundrum, How Scientific Innovation, Increased Efficiency, and Good Intentions Can Make Our Energy and Climate Problems Worse. So all of these things sound good, but this article is arguing that they can lead to more trouble in the field of energy and climate problems. And one general strategy is to pay attention to the contrast words like but. Whenever one of these shows up, probably what follows is something important. And in addition to the contrast words, like but or however, the dashes often introduce something that's important. Or the same is true of colons. So these are clues as to where the important statements are in a passage. When it comes to main purpose, we want to make sure we read the title and the first 30 lines carefully. So our conundrum is that various things make our energy and climate problems worse, or they can. And we're talking about the downfalls of building good transit and what it can do. That it can just make the roads less busy, so people that want to drive will do so, or will continue to do so. And there's lots of various reasons why, and suggestions down here of what we can do instead. If we make higher fuel taxes and parking fees and tolls and turn the roads into bike things, all of a sudden, well, you can't really drive because there's all these reasons not to. And that's what the last sentence is saying here. That if we make driving more pleasant, none of this is going to work. So I think the main point, though, is here in the first couple lines here. And that gives us the best choice for number 1, or 11, which is... So 11 is D and 12 is A. That's where you found the evidence for this. 13, as used in line 9, backed up most nearly means. So here's where it's used in this sentence. And I think they're trying to say that if you put this new transit system into place, it's not going to work unless you put other things with it that support it and help it. So A is the correct answer here. 14. In the first paragraph, the author concedes that his recommendations are. So if you concede something, you're admitting it, and you're giving up ground, and you're saying, well, a lot of people disagree with me. Which shows up right here. Needless to say, those ideas are not popular. Which is the same thing as not widely supported. 15. Based on the passage, how would the author most likely characterize many attempts to improve traffic? If, in a misguided effort to do something of environmental value, municipalities take steps to make long-distance car commuting faster or more convenient by adding lanes, building bypasses, employing traffic control, measures that make it possible for existing roads to accommodate more cars with fewer delays, replacing toll booths with radio-based systems that don't require drivers even to slow down. Here's the dash, something important. We actually make the sprawl problem worse by indirectly encouraging people to live still farther from their jobs, stores, schools, and doctors' offices, and by forcing municipalities to further extend road networks, power grids, water lines, and other civic infrastructure. So what a monster of a sentence here. But it can be well summed up by saying that we have good intentions, but the problem is they lead to environmental harm because people continue to live far away and drive far, commute far, and it makes driving more convenient than ever compared to mass transit. So we can see where this author's points are not that popular because suburban development, well, that's everywhere in this country. And 16 shows up in that line I just read, well, lines 31 through. According to the passage, reducing commuting time for drivers can have which of the following effects? If you cut commuting time by 10%, people who now drive 50 miles each way to work can justify moving 5 miles farther out, because their travel time won't change. This is how metropolitan areas metastasize. It's the history of suburban expansion. So we don't extend mass transit, that's not efficient. Instead, drivers become more willing to live farther from their places of employment than they previously were, because they can just drive, and it's still. 18, as used in line 72, promotes most nearly means. No one ever promotes a transit scheme by arguing that it would make traveling less convenient, even though from an environmental perspective, inconvenient travel is a worthy goal. So in this case, promotes means you're arguing for it, or you're presenting it, or you're saying it's a good idea and here's why. So the word advocates means that you are arguing for something and you're telling people why it's a good thing. 19, according to figure 1, how many vehicles traveled on the altered road through the Southampton city center per day before the route was altered? So I should mention that out of the 5 passages, 2 of them will have figures, and for each of those passages, 3 questions will ask about the figures. So 19, 20, and 21 all ask about the graphs or figures in this passage. So we have vehicles per day on the altered road in Southampton city center before the alteration occurred. So we're looking at this number here, 5,316. B. 20. Do the data in figure 1 support or weaken the argument of the author of the passage, and why? So this is a pretty tricky question, and what we're really trying to answer is, if you consider these columns put together before alteration and before alteration, how does that compare to these columns put together? And that's what these percentages on the right show. That is the 2 roads put together compared to after we altered the road, how traffic was there and in the surrounding roads. And there's a net reduction in traffic for each of these. So we're definitely supporting what the author was saying, that if we make it less convenient to drive by eliminating some of the roadways, people won't drive as much and will use mass transit, and that will help the environment. So we can rule out the 2 that say weaken, and we definitely want a net reduction in traffic. B. 21. Based on figure 2, the engineers surveyed were most skeptical of the idea that in the event of a reallocation of road space, drivers would change what? So we're looking for the largest no's here, which is their driving style, and maybe whether they car share. D. Their driving style was the best answer. It had the largest no out of all the engineers surveyed. Passage 3, one of the 2 science passages. Not as easy to follow in terms of thesis and diction, but if you summarize what's going on in each paragraph, big picture-wise, it helps you figure out what the passage is about, rather than getting tripped up. 22. Based on the passage, textbook authors in the early 1990s would most likely have expected which condition to result from the blocking of fast fibers. So they talk about slow conducting nerves, pain and temperature, fast signaling nerves, pressure and vibration. So if we're blocking the fast, we're blocking pressure and vibration. D is the only one that shows impairment to perceiving vibration. And the answer there was found in lines 4 through 7, which I had underlined. 24, as used in line 18, active most nearly means. So here's the slow fibers that might be active in humans. So we're talking about nerves. So here, active is most closely described as, or most nearly means 25, as used in line 24. Capture most nearly means. So we're capturing electrical impulses. Now this isn't quite like capture the flag, but we're recording what happened. See. So it is often the case here that it's a secondary definition. Capture usually means something like seize, but to record is a secondary definition. Similar to how active means to move a lot, but present is more of a secondary definition. 26. Which conclusion is best supported by the findings of Alison's 1993 experiment? And here when we talk about soft stroking prompting both an immediate and a delayed signal, which identified nerve impulses traveling at slower speeds, C is the best choice. The gentle pressure is sensed not only by fast fibers, but also by, which was here in lines 26 through 28. So we'll go with B. 28, the sentence in lines 43 through 45 serves mainly two. So here's the sentence. But why exactly humans might have such fibers which respond only to a narrow range of rather subtle stimuli was initially mystifying. So they found these nerves, they've confirmed their existence, but they don't know why they exist. So that's a problem from the perspective of their team that they went on to study and try to figure out. 29, it can reasonably be inferred that one of the intended goals of the 1999 experiment was to determine the... So here's the paragraph that talks about this. He wanted to know several things. One is where the brush touches the arm. And then beyond that, could that same fiber convey a pleasant sensation? So we're talking about the precise nature of sensations. A. 30. The main purpose of the sixth paragraph is to... And here they introduce this patient known as GL and kind of describe her past, this penicillin thing that made her lose responsiveness to pressure, and that we find out that her quick conducting fibers were gone. So she can still sense warmth. Maybe her slow conducting fibers are still there. So we're giving some background on this particular patient. We're not really trying to cure her or compare the nerve function of this patient to others, but instead it's why this condition is of value to the experiment. If the patient only has slow-moving fibers, then we can study without having to block. 31. According to the passage, GL differed from Alison's other test subjects in terms of the... And the answers here in normal subjects, we see that both the somatosensory and insular cortices were activated, but for GL it was only the insular one. So only one cortex instead of multiple. The answer is A, the number of cortices activated in the brain during gentle brushing. 32. According to the passage, humans experience an emotional aspect of touch when... So this sentence, the very last one of the passage, talks about conveying a more emotional quality of touch, and that's talking about CT fibers. It's when these fibers are exposed to a stimulus. B. On every reading test, one of the 5 passages is a 2-passage selection. There's a passage 1 here and then a passage 2, and we have to read them both and analyze them separately and then compare them. This is also the passage that's part of the great global conversation. And these texts are usually harder because they're from history and they might be from some other country and it might be a translation, and you have to kind of have a general understanding of some big events and themes that happen throughout the history of the world to really contextualize. 33 starts with passage 1. Beveridge asserts that the resources and immensity of the United States constitute A. So if you haven't figured it out by now, these questions kind of go in order in the passage. So you'd expect this to be at the beginning of passage 1, and that's where it is. We see some statements about a land that can feed and clothe the world. There's the resources, and whose coastlines would enclose half the countries. There's how big it is. And here, bracketed in red, that God has given us. It's a divine gift to the American people. In the second paragraph, the commands given by Beveridge mainly serve to... So there's 4 commands here, 4 things that you're supposed to think of. Let's go through them briefly. In this first one, it's about Americans pouring into Hawaii and Puerto Rico because the laws cover those islands with justice and safety. And the next one, bunch of Americans going to the Philippines because they're going to have order and equity. And the next one, Americans building a civilization of energy and industry in Cuba, because we'll have a government of law replacing anarchy and tyranny. The prosperous millions that Empress of Islands will support. When obedient to the law of political gravitation, her people ask for the highest honor liberty can bestow, the sacred order of the stars and stripes, the citizenship of the great republic. All of these are talking about anticipating and describing the benefits of a proposed policy. As used in line 72, the word recalled most nearly means, someone has said that a truth once spoken can never be recalled. So the most obvious definition for recalled probably is remembered, but that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at a secondary definition, retracted. You can never take it back. 36, it can reasonably be inferred from passage 2 that Brian considers the preference for national sovereignty over foreign rule to be a, so we expect races to protest against foreign rule. And it's about freedom, liberty, or death. And later on down here we see that God never made a race of people so low in the scale of civilization or intelligence that it would welcome a foreign master. Everybody wants to rule themselves. That's in every human heart. That's D, an innate drive towards self-rule. And that evidence was found in C, lines 79 through 81. 38, as used in line 85, calculate most nearly means, those who would have this nation enter upon a career of empire must consider not only the effect of imperialism on the Filipinos, but they must also calculate its effects upon our own nation. So in math class, we often calculate by multiplying, but here we're evaluating. So we had a couple questions about passage 1, a couple questions about passage 2, and here's where things get tricky, because we have to compare the two. 39. In developing their respective arguments, Beveridge, passage 1, and Bryan, passage 2, both express admiration for the... So in passage 1, we read about a glorious history, a chosen people. And here in passage 2, our whole history has been an encouragement not only to the Filipinos, but to all who are denied a voice in their own government. Both of these are talking about the founding and history of the United States, and how we are a beacon for freedom and democracy. So we should probably just go back and recap. Passage 1 is saying that America is great. It's so great we should spread our ideals elsewhere. And basically, like the European countries, we should form an empire and have colonies. Passage 2 also says that America is pretty great, but if we started taking over other countries and telling them what to do, well, that goes against our founding principles. Which is what B is saying in number 40. Beveridge says that we're so exemplary, it justifies conquest, will improve other countries. But passage 2 says that the exemplary qualities of America would be undermined if we engaged in imperial expansion. We would take away freedoms of others, which is what we're built on, having those. 41. It can most reasonably be inferred from passage 2 that Bryan would criticize the vision of American governance of island territories that Beveridge presents in passage 1 for being, so probably down here at the bottom, her people ask for the highest honor liberty can bestow, citizenship of the great republic. If another country takes over by military might and changes your laws, are you going to be grateful and desire to be a citizen of that country? That's probably a little bit naive. They would be objecting to American government, which shows up here in lines 42 through 48. When we go on to say that we must expect the subject races to protest and resist to the extent of their ability. The opposite of what passage 1 is saying. Passage 5, the second science passage, we see some charts or figures. So that means there's 11 questions instead of 10 because the last 3 are about the figures. So this passage is about farmers and weeds. And plowing the field brings the seeds of weeds to the surface, and they're exposed to the sun. And when that happens, they start to germinate. But what if you do it at night, when the sun's not out? According to the passage, exposure to light allows seeds to what? Begin to develop. So it shows up throughout, but one example here is that seeds being briefly exposed to sunlight stimulates their germination. 44. The question in the second paragraph primarily serves to, here's the question, do the blades of a plow, which can reach more than a foot beneath the soil surface, bring some of these buried seeds to the surface, where their germination is induced by exposure to sunlight? So this is introducing the specific research topic addressed in the passage. When they run a control on an experiment later, this is what they're testing. 45, as used in line 16, induced most nearly means. They're talking about where the germination is induced by exposure to sunlight. The best choice here is stimulated or activated by exposure to sunlight. 46, which choice best supports the idea that seeds present in fields plowed at night are exposed to some amount of light? Starting in line 43, although even under these conditions, hundreds of millions of photons strike each square millimeter of ground each second, this illumination is below the threshold needed to stimulate the germination of most seeds. 46 is C. Next two are paired questions. They go together. The passage suggests that if Seidel had planted wheat or corn on the two agricultural strips in Hartmann's experiment, the percentage of the surface of each strip covered with weeds would likely have been. Well, that brings us here. No crops were planted in these pilot experiments to avoid possible competition with the emerging weeds. Lower than the percentage that Hartmann found, because some of the weeds would have died out because of competition with the crops. That was found in B, lines 60 through 62. As used in line 62, dramatic most nearly means the results were dramatic, so it's a comparison of more than 80% to 2%. So it's kind of like saying that the results were significant or impressive. And then the last three are about the table. So according to the table, in which soil sample disturbed in darkness did the fewest number of seedlings emerge? So we're looking at darkness and at samples A, B, C, and D, so the first four. This is the lowest, 0. 50 is A. 51, as presented in the table, which sample produced the most seedlings when the soil was disturbed in light? And we're looking at G, H, I, and J. So out of the ones for light, we're looking at the bottom four. I had the most, so 51 is C. The data presented in the table most directly support which claim from the passage? So looking at the table, the numbers for darkness are low. They're 3 or below, and the numbers for light are higher. There's a lot of them that are 4 and above. So that shows up here. Thus, the germination of wheat seeds would be minimized if farmers simply plowed their fields during the night, which is D, lines 38 through 43.